Hi, I'm Carmen,
And I'm Steven, and this is Vienna Past and Present.
where we walk through the gilded and sometimes not so gilded halls of Vienna's history.
So here we are at our usual planned meeting time. News just dropped that Biden is dropping out of the presidential race. So will this shocked feeling bleed through to our recording today? We'll see. And why does this feel so familiar? It's like when we were on vacation and Brexit happened.
Right. We were on the beach together in Cuba when we found out about Brexit. And today, just before we started recording, this news dropped. So, bit of a pattern for us, it seems like.
Yeah, we've been able to stare blankly at each other for a few big political moments in the last several years. But will this episode be 30 minutes of silence today? No, because we made some notes beforehand. So what are we talking about today?
Yes, we come prepared. So today is a bit of a follow-up to the AEIOU episode, which was our last episode. So if you haven't listened to that, you might want to go back and listen. But that said, you can still easily follow today's episode, even if you skipped AEIOU. Anyway,
Right.
Long story short, we are talking about Habsburg colonial ambitions today and some of the little-known colonies that the Habsburgs had around the world.
Yeah, so that's kind of how we do it on the show. We go where the quirky stories take us. So let's just be clear that overseas colonial stories like these are pretty universally problematic, destructive to native people. But today we're going to focus on the, remarkably clumsy, I would say, Austrian attempts in some interesting corners of the world during a 100 years-ish stretch between the 1780s and the early 1900s. And it wasn't always like this. The Austrian Habsburg Empire was really big at one point. Carmen, what all belonged to it when it was at its largest?
Right, so the size of the empire fluctuated quite a lot, but the Habsburg Empire really was mostly a land empire, meaning that it generally expanded at its peripheries. And so at its largest extent within Europe, it included everything from Sicily to Romania to the Netherlands. So that was around the 1720s. But the Habsburg Empire did also have some overseas colonies and territories. Do you happen to know what any of them are?
If I had to guess, I would guess they had like a single Caribbean island, maybe a port city in India, and or a few blocks in Shanghai. Those would be like my boilerplate guesses for any European power. How close am I?
Yeah, those are the classics. And you're kind of close, I have to say. They did have Mexico as part of the Spanish Habsburg possessions, so maybe that's the Habsburg version of a Caribbean island.
Yeah.
But the Spanish possessions in the New World, firstly, they're fairly well known, and they came under Habsburg rule with the succession of Charles V to both the Austrian and the Spanish thrones. But we kind of want to focus on the Austrians today.
Right. The Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs, they were pretty distinct franchises, I guess you could say, by like 1700 or so, right? So we're going to focus on these later attempts. This is not a complete list either, just some lesser known, maybe especially ill-fated examples.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, where to first?
So first up is Mozambique. Were you expecting that?
No, this just sounds like kind of a Portuguese like neighborhood for this sort of activity. Maybe that's a spoiler?
It is a bit of a spoiler, although I guess it's fairly well known that Mozambique was essentially a Portuguese colony. But the Habsburgs, the Austrians, also had a small colony there, an attempt at establishing a territory there in Delagoa Bay, which is also known as Maputo Bay.
Okay.
So they set up a trading post and a factory in 1778 after making a treaty with the local chieftains. And the main thing that they did there was this factory was really their main trade. And they traded in ivory, which was very lucrative. And you mentioned the Portuguese. The Portuguese were also part of this whole story because there was quite a conflict ultimately between the Portuguese and the Austrians because the Austrian ivory output was greater than the Portuguese output, and so that drastically changed the prices, dropped the prices, and the Portuguese were not particularly happy.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Right. So the Portuguese were also active on Mozambique at this time, and the ivory prices started to become a real issue. And that did end up kind of spelling the end of the short-lived Austrian colony. But the first thing that happened was a malaria outbreak in 1781, so that already kind of weakened their hold on this factory and on this land. And ultimately, the Portuguese then managed to kick out the Austrian colonists.
Wow, okay, so just a couple years. All right, there we go.
It was ultimately a very short-lived colony of about 3 years. And I would say it probably had little to no lasting impact and is very little known.
Okay, like no lasting impact on like the colonial landscape, right? Okay, and we're not talking about like no impact on natives or something like that.
No, but it was only 3 years. And so in terms of,
Right.
any lasting infrastructure
Yeah.
or anything like that, very little impact.
Right.
And like you said, when you hear Mozambique, you think more Portuguese than you think Austrian.
Okay, weird little warm up potentially. What's next?
Next up, we go even further afield, which is we go further east to the Nicobar Islands. And so this was really right around the same time. So after setting up their post in Mozambique, the Austrians moved on to the Nicobar Islands.
Okay, simultaneously. All right. Look at them go. Hmm.
Do you actually know where the Nicobar Islands are?
Yes. So I knew of this because that there was that documentary about the American missionary that like went to this island and was, killed by natives there. Sort of to me, like kind of a wacky documentary story. So yeah, I was aware because of that, but I mean, maybe I looked at a globe once and saw them. Otherwise, that's kind of my extent of my knowledge.
Yeah, I wouldn't have exactly known where they are either. They are in the Indian Ocean and they belong to India now. I kind of only knew about them because friends of mine from India went to the Nicobar Islands on vacation, and that sort of brought it to my consciousness. But the Austrians apparently knew where they were because they moved on from Mozambique to the Nicobar Islands, and they had previously been colonized by the Danish. So the Danish had been there in 1756 already, but had abandoned the Nicobar Islands after a malaria outbreak, which seems to be kind of a through line in these countries, that some of these European colonial powers sort of,
Yeah.
abandoned these colonies when there were these malaria outbreaks that they couldn't really deal with. So the Danish got out of there,
Okay.
and then the Austrians showed up, and they took possession of the islands in 1778 and signed a treaty with the natives there. So the natives apparently signed a document that ceded all 24 islands to the Austrians. But I think the natives must have been seriously confused about what these randos were doing there all of a sudden, and I doubt they even knew that they were a colony.
Yeah, that kind of seems like it seems like their presence is so like skeletal anyway, if the last one's any indication. So yeah, like I'm sure they, didn't know what they were quote signing either. Like Habsburgs, they seem to love their paperwork, their forged documents through time. That's like another through line for them.
Right. Bureaucracy was always a big thing for the Habsburgs, and that legacy lives on today in Vienna. I can tell you that.
Nice.
So, yeah, who knows what language this was in? I'm sure the natives had no idea what was going on. And yes, similar to the previous example, in Mozambique, it was also a very, very small affair. So effectively, they signed this treaty, quote unquote, signed this treaty. And then they apparently raised an Austrian flag on a nearby hill, and the colony was effectively founded by 6 men with some slaves, cattle, and some weapons.
Okay, what a colony. Is there any information about why this one? Was this like to trade a certain thing? Is this like this was just to kind of have a colony? Did you get any sense?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly why the Nicobar Islands, actually. I mean, maybe because it was semi-available because the Danish had abandoned it, right? During this time, most European countries were sort of vying with each other.
Right, and I think at this point, too, there were this idea of, like, a colony that was on the way to something. So I wonder if that's what this was, right? Where it was like, this would be a good stopover if you are trading in spices or something.
Right, but as we will see, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of strategy going on here with the Austrians. I think it was more of a, look, the other European powers are doing this, let's get in on it. But they didn't exactly know what they wanted to do with any of this, as far as I can tell.
Right, okay, so how did it go?
Not particularly well. It lasted a little bit longer than the short colony in Mozambique, but not much longer. So by 1781, so that's the same timeline as Mozambique, right? Both were founded in 1778. Mozambique, Maputo Bay, had been given up by 1781. In that same time, 1781, in the Nicobar Islands, the colonists were complaining that they lacked drinking water and didn't have enough food and were petitioning to Vienna to get support, and Vienna just straight ignored them.
Wow, okay, this is not like a serious attempt or something. That's interesting. Okay, you're not even sending them food. Okay, so like if you look at a map, these islands are far from the mainland, like in India or Southeast Asia there. I can't imagine how they thought this was going to just work.
Yeah, it seems like they thought they didn't have to actually put any effort into it, really, which is probably for the best for the natives, less impact ultimately. But yeah, a very half-hearted, half-assed attempt, I would say, from the Habsburg side of things. So ultimately, they did hold on to the colony a little bit longer. They managed to do okay until their leader died in 1783. And then by 1785, all of the colonists had abandoned the islands. So it lasted a bit longer, but not a particularly long-lived affair either.
Okay.
They didn't quite make it to the 10-year mark.
Okay, but we're not done yet. Next up, let's keep moving east. Austria-Hungary jumped on the let's grab a city in China bandwagon.
Yes, right. So in the 20th century, the early 20th century, this was what was going on. Lots of European countries were having these concessions in China, right? And like most of the rest of Europe, Austria-Hungary also had a concession, but it's probably the least well-known, I would say, of all the concessions in China. It was called Tianjin, and they held it from 1902 until 1917.
Okay.
So just a bit of background on this. The Qing dynasty, after the Boxer Rebellion, granted these concessions. So the Boxer Rebellion itself was an anti-imperialist movement in China that was defeated by an alliance of 8 European nations, and that included Austria-Hungary. And so the Qing dynasty, the Chinese dynasty at the time, I say granted, they were forced basically to give up these concessions and to cede some land to these European powers that had put down this anti-imperialist movement.
Okay, yeah, and I've definitely studied this like in high school, right? In kind of a survey-ish kind of high school way that you hear about this stuff. Like from what I remember, forgive me for being skeptical of Austria's impact on putting down this rebellion. I did some checking on that. I found that it sent 4 cruisers, less than 300 soldiers, which was considered a minor contribution to the military effort. So just to be clear, they did not, send armies, and like you never, heard about this in school. And so it was just kind of minor.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of riding on the coattails of others going on here, that the Austrian Hungarians just kind of jumped in and, claimed their concession as well. But they also had the shortest lived concession of all the European concessions, although it technically outlived the Austrian-Hungarian Empire itself, which I will get to in a second. But it was also one of the smallest ones as well. There were multiple concessions in Tianjin. It was quite an important trading city. It was on the water just east of Beijing. So during this time, you had the Belgians, you had the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, the Russians, all of them had concessions in Tianjin, and then the Austrian-Hungarian Empire had their one little concession as well.
Okay, so they made a minor contribution to the political effort. Like, was their concession minor, or was it like a substantial sized one?
No, not exactly. I think the size of their concession reflected the size of their contribution, which was fairly minor. So it was very small.
Okay.
It was 0.6 square kilometers, so it was a very small little area.
Wow. Okay. Like not the Vatican City kind of like sized.
Yeah,
Okay.
very small. It had a population of about 30,000 people, and it was maintained by 40 Austrian-Hungarian Marines and 80 Chinese militia. So it was not a big production.
Right. So to me, that's like barely staffed 24/7 kind of levels. All right.
Yes. So what they did set up some schools and some barracks, a hospital, etc. And one thing that I think is quite interesting is that they gave the local population citizenship, which is not something that generally happened in colonies. So that's kind of a unique aspect of this concession that they had.
Yeah.
But I think the most interesting aspect of it actually is that with the outbreak of World War I, Austria-Hungary couldn't maintain control of this anymore, right? They had, other issues to deal with. And so it was very quickly taken over by the Chinese in 1917. But interestingly, neither Austria nor Hungary gave up, officially, the colony or gave up its claim until 1919 and 1920, respectively. And Austria-Hungary actually already collapsed in 1918. So technically, this colony outlived Austria-Hungary. So officially, they sort of had a colony for a year to 2 years longer than they themselves existed, which is sort of a strange historical anomaly.
Yeah, there's something kind of like quirky about that, right? Like Austria-Hungary still existed in a couple blocks in China.
Right, on paper at least.
Beyond the, European one itself. Yeah, these are definitely some quirky episodes. Okay, I don't know what else to say. Is there any lasting impact, you think? Like, does anybody talk about this in Austria, for example?
It's not extremely well known, I wouldn't say. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburg Empire are pretty much always considered a land empire. Nobody really ever thinks about the overseas concessions that they had. So it's not much discussed, and I think a lot of people don't even know really that these kind of random little colonies existed. Also, they were very short-lived for the most part. So,
Right.
Maputo Bay and the Nicobar Islands is a couple of years. But it is kind of the one period where Austria did try to have this more global footprint, but it really didn't work out very well. There is a bit of lasting impact, though, especially in Tianjin, which was, of these three that we discussed today, the colony that existed for the longest time and also the most recent one, right? That was in the 20th century. And so there is some architecture in Tianjin that is still there today from the time of this colony.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be interesting to look at pictures of that. We can try to find some of that and put them in the show notes.
Yeah, I can post some links. I looked up a few photos, and some of the photos that I saw, it really looks like it could be some street in like the 7th district of Vienna. The architecture is very familiar to me.
Oh, all right. Yeah, so these were not the strongest attempts. They were each kind of phoned in, maybe we could say, compared to some of the other European powers, like sailing all over the world and plundering around the same time. Are there any other maybe broader reasons why this was so kind of instantly doomed? Is it just because, Austria-Hungary had other things going on at the time?
I think that's a big part of it, but like I said already a bit earlier, there was not much of a strategy. They didn't go into this with a real effort to, trade in spices or, to really build up anything. It was a lot more kind of joining the colonial game because that's what other European powers were doing. So there wasn't much of a strategy, and there was also a lack of focus on it. So as you said, they had other things going on. They were mostly concerned with Hungary at the time. Hungary, until it became the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, there was a lot of unrest, and there were a lot of questions about how to deal with Hungary within the empire, and so a lot of the focus went to that. And the Balkans as well. The Balkans were always a big focus. And in fact, in general, to go back to the question of what people here would say about Austrian colonies, most of them would say Bosnia as like the one colony that the Austrians had.
A colony. Okay. That sounds like an interesting maybe follow-up episode. But yeah, I guess, from my sense, Austria was always dealing with stuff on its borders, like on its kind of complicated borders with, the Ottomans or the Prussians or, kind of everyone in their neighborhood, versus like Portugal is kind of on the coast and, off on its own and doesn't have the same pressures like that. Okay, that makes sense.
Right. That probably contributed quite a bit as well, because Austria-Hungary had to police all of its borders on all sides, right? The British, they're an island, the Portuguese, they're on the coast, the Dutch, the big powers, the Spanish as well, they don't have that many borders that they have to somehow manage and maintain, and so the Austrian Habsburgs had to sort of be fighting on all fronts all the time, or maintaining kind of all borders at all times.
Yeah.
And they also had, of course, less direct access to the Atlantic, which may have also played a role, that to even get out to the ocean, they had to somehow get through the Mediterranean, which had a lot of other European powers controlling certain areas of that. And so they had Trieste, that was the main port, but getting out into the Atlantic and actually really getting places was probably not as easy for the Habsburgs as it would have been for the British, the Dutch, the Spanish, etc.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so that was sort of I would say sort of half-assed and lackluster attempt at colonization by the Habsburgs. As we said in the beginning, it's not an exhaustive list, so there were a couple of other little attempts, but none of them were any more successful or longer-lived. So they made an effort, but didn't really go very far.
Yeah, and I guess they live on in the memory of Wikipedia, at least, okay, where there's not some architecture left over. All right.
Indeed. So that's it for our show. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, share with your friends or leave us a 5-star review. And if you didn't like it, then, well, don't worry about that review.
You can find us on social medias, Vienna Past and Present on Instagram, or send us your episode ideas at viennapastandpresent@gmail.com.
Auf Wiedersehen, pfiat euch, Baba.
Bye.